Are you a businesswoman who is finding it challenging to get your ideas across and make a point? Welcome to Speakers Who Get Results with Elizabeth Bachman, a podcast dedicated to helping women get the visibility they want, whether making a speech or talking in a meeting. Every week, get valuable lessons from Elizabeth or learn from her roundtable conversations with experts and speakers on how to make a difference, not just a point. On to the show with your host, Elizabeth Bachman.
Hello, and welcome to Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host, and this is the podcast where we interview experts from around the world on such subjects as leadership, diversity, communication skills, and presentation. My guest today is Dr. Evelyn Carter, who is a specialist on diversity, equity, and inclusion. But before I go into her bio, I'd like to invite you to see how your presentation skills are doing by taking our free 4-minute assessment at speakforresultsquiz.com. That's www.speakforresultsquiz.com. And that's where you can see in 4 minutes where your presentation skills are strong and where perhaps a little bit of support could help you get the results you need and the recognition that you deserve. My guest today is Dr. Evelyn Carter, who was recommended to me. And when I first met her, I said, yes, absolutely. Very interesting person, lots to talk about. Her official bio is that she is a social psychologist who has conducted cutting-edge research on how to detect and discuss racial bias. As Paradigm Strategies president, Evelyn is focused on evolving and advancing the practice of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Prior to this, she led Paradigm's training and people development teams and advised such companies as DocuSign, the National Football League, SNAP, and United Talent Agency. Evelyn's research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, and in 2018, she was featured on the Indiana University College of Arts and Sciences 20 under 40 list. In addition to her peer-reviewed scholarship, Evelyn is a highly sought-after thought leader. Her work and insights have been published in popular press outlets such as The Atlantic, Bloomberg, CBS This Morning, CNBC, Fast Company, Harvard Business Review, and NPR. Evelyn holds a doctorate from Indiana University, a master's degree from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and a bachelor's degree from Northwestern University. We had a wonderful conversation about how to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how to start broadening your borders, your boundaries, so that you can be a better leader for everybody, having intentional about diversity. Here's the interview with Dr. Evelyn Carter. Evelyn Carter, I am so honored that you were able to come and join me at Speakers Who Get Results. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Elizabeth. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, one of the joys of being a podcast host is that you get to talk to really interesting people. So when we spoke last week, I thought, oh boy, you're going to be hearing from me. I'm going to keep talking to you because you're so interesting.
It's fantastic.
Before I get into the official topic, let me ask you, who would be your dream interview? If you could interview someone who's no longer with us at the moment, who would it be? What would you ask them? And who should be listening?
Those are great questions. Okay, so I will confess that I often have a difficulty with this kind of question because I feel like usually people are like, pick some wonderful historic figure, whatnot. But I would pick my grandmother, who is a historic figure to me, my dad's mom in particular, Martha Ree Muntz Carter. I would pick her because my grandmother, I didn't realize until I was like, kind of when she was later in life and I was more of an adult, how funny she is and how witty she is. Like, she's very quiet, but she would say these kind of like comments. Like, my grandmother was throwing shade before throwing shade was a thing, and you just like had to catch it. But also she had a really interesting life. So she grew up in Georgia and then got married. She moved to Connecticut. She went to secretary school. She had 5 children. She worked for the Postal Service for most of her career. She was a strong woman of faith. And I think she was just a cool lady. So I would love to interview her. And I want to actually ask her about her life. One of the things that I remember reading in her obituary was how she, had these degrees at the time and, this training. And then there was some line about how she followed her true calling in life to be a mother. And I remember being like, is that how she would phrase it? I don't know. I'm curious.
Yeah.
And so, things like that, I really, she was born in 1927, I think. And so getting a chance to hear from her about what it was like growing up and what it meant to be a modern woman who was working with 5 children at the time would be really interesting. And the kind of things that she saw as she was a part of the Great Migration from the South up north. And I think anyone who is interested in a surprisingly intriguing and like funny conversation with a witty person should be listening. So I think everybody should listen. So I would interview my grandmother.
That's wonderful. And this is actually one of the things that I've started tracking in the 2.5 years, more than 2.5 years of this podcast. Of one of the categories is ancestors. Who wants to interview an ancestor? And I often think my grandmother died when I was 24. I was living in New York. I was a couple years out of college. I was involved in my big New York life and, all involved in myself. And now I think, gee, I would love to go back and ask her more about her life.
Yeah.
I wish I'd been more aware at the time, but your early 20s, you're not usually. So
Yeah.
You are a DEI, so diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yes.
And you're a scientist who
Yes.
talks about diversity, equity, and inclusion. A lot of people think of it as kind of this wishy-washy thing. Some people think it's just victim mentality. And right now there are politicians we're having a backlash against it. What is the science behind diversity, equity, and inclusion? And it seems appalling to have to ask this, but what's the business case for having a policy and then doing it?
Yeah. So there's lots of science behind diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for me, a lot of that begins with understanding what inclusion actually means. So when I think about the research that's been done on how to create environments where people feel like they belong, that is research that informs diversity, equity, and inclusion policies and practices at all range of organization types. So for example, we know that belonging, that feeling that you are a part of a group is really important. Everybody has the need to belong. What we also know is that people who are from marginalized groups, people who are new to an environment, people who are facing challenges, whether it's because they are underperforming or because they're ascending in their careers, are especially at risk for something that's called belonging uncertainty. And what that means is that your sense of whether you belong or not is tied to how good things are going that day. So you could say, I got great feedback on a presentation that I did at work. I feel like I belong today. But if the next day you don't close the deal that you've been working on, then you might not feel like you belong. And what we know is that people who are from those groups that are extra vulnerable are more likely to experience that fluctuation of, yes, I do belong. No, I don't. Yes, I do. No, I don't. And that undermines their ability to just be confident that they belong in these different environments and ultimately undermines their ability to do their best work. And there's a lot of research that's been done on this. And so when we think about what the science is behind diversity, equity, inclusion, part of it is simply how do we create environments that mitigate belonging uncertainty and foster belonging for everyone?
Talk a little bit about mitigate's a tricky word for our international listeners. Talk a little bit more about that, about belonging uncertainty and how you can reduce it or deal with it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I say that it's important to mitigate belonging uncertainty, what I mean is it's important to reduce it, to get rid of it as much as possible, right? Ultimately, We want everyone to know for a fact, without a doubt, that they belong, and that their belonging is not linked to whether they are successful or fail in a particular task at work, at school, what have you. So that's really the goal. How do we do that? There's lots of ways. Some research by lots of folks points to the importance of different cues to belonging. So your listeners and viewers, if you're choosing to watch the video, will be able to see my background. I've got lots of cues that tell you about who I am and what I believe in my background. It's very intentionally curated, because what we know is that people are looking for those kinds of cues to say, what does that person believe?
Well, and will it be safe? Will it be safe to trust them?
Exactly. So things like, what is in the environment around you? You can also think about belonging cues being, what do people say? So when you say, I explicitly am excited to welcome you to my team. I'm looking forward to learning from you. I'm excited to hear about the different feedback that you have. I want you to push back. That's telling somebody, hey, I am excited to hear from you, even if you're telling me something that makes me bristle a little bit, right? And so that kind of cue is really important. And then another cue that's really important is numerical representation, which goes back to diversity. What research by Dr. Valerie Purdy-Greenaway and many other colleagues has found is that when people, particularly those who are from groups that are underrepresented, so very few, when you're in the numerical minority, when you enter an environment, you look around and say, are there people like me here?
Yeah.
And if the answer is no, then you say, why not? Where are they? So to put this in context, when I was looking for undergraduate schools that I was going to go to, I ended up going to Northwestern, a very proud Wildcat. My mom and I visited the campus, and we would just walk up and down the main thoroughfare of campus, counting the number of Black people that we saw. And there's research behind why that's important. What Dr. Greenaway's research finds is that when you are a member of a group that is underrepresented and you see lots of people who look like you, it makes you trust the organization more. You say, okay, I know I'm going to be safe here. So that numerical representation is actually pretty key. So those are some of the things that you can do to make people feel like they belong. I know you asked me to part two, but I'm going to pause here because I feel like I just said a lot of things.
You did. And actually, it makes me think about some of the work that my colleagues are doing, getting women onto corporate boards.
Yes.
And the magic number seems to be 3. You can have one person and then you're the token. If you have 2 people, say you have 2 women or 2 Black people or 2 Asians, then it's like, oh, those 2. By the way, if you're one of the 2, never ever sit together, because then you become like the one token.
Yes.
The magic number seems to be 3 in a committee. And I have noticed that I grew up being one of the few women doing what I was doing in a male-dominated industry. So I do know that part from the inside. When you talk about cues for belonging, is there a let's talk a little bit about what happens when you get higher up in an organization, because many organizations, you find that skill and ability gets you to a certain point, and then comes the glass ceiling. How can we think about representation using DEI? Let's talk about DEI and glass ceilings.
Yes.
I want to hear what you have to say, and then I can ask the rest of my questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I think about the concept of a glass ceiling, and there's a variety of other kind of versions of this, but ultimately the idea is that if you are a member of a group that is not well represented in business, for example, there's only so far you can go before you start hitting some kind of ceiling. And so that's the general idea, right?
Yep.
What is interesting to me is that when it comes to moving past that, there's lots of interventions that are helpful, but one of them is having mentors and sponsors who can help get you access to those higher levels, right? And so a lot of times what I'm doing in my work with executives is encouraging them to sponsor people who don't look like them, because most executives, particularly in the United States, are white and male and tend to be older. And there's this interesting phenomenon that the Center for Talent Innovation talked about in their 2019 report called mini-me syndrome.
Ah.
What they found is that about 70%, I think it was around there, of executives tend to sponsor people who share their same race and gender. And so if you're a white guy in an executive position and you are sponsoring your mini-me, all you're doing is helping more white guys get ahead. And if you want to help women, for example, break through that glass ceiling, you've got to make sure that you are going beyond the people who give you that warm, fuzzy feeling of, oh, you just remind me of myself. And instead, you're thinking about, what are the values that you hold? Are those values to increase representation, to remove barriers that might be there that are holding well-qualified people back? If so, sponsor some different folks, right? Help give them access to the places that you know are going to be critical. What I also find, though, is that there's structural things that you can do. So I was working with a company once who had this wonderful program that helped people get into that executive level of leadership at their organization. Like, it was one of those things, like, you get into the program, it is almost guaranteed that within the next cycle, you'll be promoted. And when I asked them how they selected people for that program, they said, well, we have people who previously went through the program recommend others that, you know, they think should go through it. And I was like, therein lies the problem. Have you taken a look at the diversity of the cohorts that have come through this program recently? And when they did, they were shocked to find it was quite homogenous. And so both at an individual level, I'm encouraging people to sponsor folks who don't look like them, but also with some of those more structural programs, I'm saying, how can you make sure you are not engineering bias into your opportunities to get people into these higher levels of leadership?
Basically, pipeline.
Yes.
Yeah, strengthening the pipeline was
Yes.
the other question I was going to ask you about.
Great.
And one of the other things that I think is really interesting is thinking about how you measure people. For years, women have been measured by the standards that men are measured. So you're only rated on the male things, the things that guys do, instead of being rated on the things that women do that guys don't notice. Same with minority, is that you have to be intentional about diversity and make an effort until it becomes something that everybody takes for granted.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which would probably take a long time to get there. But yeah, you've
Yeah.
got to be intentional until it becomes routinized. Absolutely.
Yes, I do. I'm old enough to remember when seatbelts in cars became required. And I was a kid going to school, and we had to wear seatbelts for the carpool. And one of the parents who drove us refused to let us have seatbelts because it was infringing his freedom. This whole thing that we've heard over and over again. Now we take seatbelts for granted, but it had to be legislated. There had to be a law requiring it to get people to do what's going to be better for them. So
Yeah.
let me ask you, when we were talking about this earlier, you spoke of having a growth mindset around DEI, so diversity, equity, inclusion. If you think about really actually having a growth mindset about bias.
Yeah.
How can bias be an occasion for growth?
That's a great question. And I think something that's beneath that question is like, oh my gosh, like, when somebody gets called biased or racist or homophobic, like those are big words that are very scary and that can feel like they are undermining your personhood, right? So and
people get defensive about it.
Yeah. So how is it that these big scary words can actually be an opportunity to say, I can do better? Well, there's some research on it.
Wait, say that again. It's an opportunity to say, I can do better.
I can do better. Yeah, that's right. So part of why that is that first, Dr. Carol Dweck talks about how there's kind of two ways that people think about where different traits and skills come from. One is that people tend to have more of a fixed mindset or an entity theory, which is that you're born with a certain level of talent, right? You are as good at basketball as you were ever going to get when you're born, and that's it. There's another perspective, which is a growth mindset or more of an incremental theory, which says that, yeah, talent is a starting point, but with time and effort and by learning from your mistakes, you can improve. You can go from a junior varsity level basketball player to a varsity level basketball player if you just try and practice hard enough.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take that and apply it to the concept of bias, there are lots of folks, Dr. Anita Rattan, Dr. Jessica Neal, and many others, who have looked at how people who think about bias as something that isn't fixed, but that is something that is malleable, that can change over time, respond when they get feedback. And what they found is that if you believe that bias is something that you can change, then when somebody tells you, that wasn't good what you just said, sure, you might at first be like, oh goodness, this feels really threatening. But ultimately, you're more likely to say, thank you so much for telling me that, because you see it as an opportunity to change your behavior for the future. And that's far less threatening than someone who believes that bias is this innate characteristic that you have. Because if that's the case, and I tell you you're biased, I give you that feedback, I have just proven your worst fear. So that's why having a growth mindset is so important.
Well, and we've seen it a lot in the acceptance of the gay community over the last 20, 30 years. The statistics say that the more people, if you know someone who's gay, you stop being afraid. It's the more you know people, the more it becomes obvious, it's taken for granted, like seatbelts, then the easier it is. But we do have to go through that position, that period of adjustment.
Yeah. And that period of adjustment is an interesting one, right? Because just as there's research showing that having somebody who is gay or having somebody who is from a different racial or ethnic group or who is disabled when you are not disabled in your friendship network can be helpful, the flip side of that, or the other side of that, is that sometimes you can start to compartmentalize that person, right? And say, well, you're not like the other gay people because you're my friend. And so having that growth mindset is really important, actually, because you need to be willing to not see that person through the lens of stereotypes, right? And see them for who they are and how they identify, and all of their individual characteristics as well. So there's some really tricky things that our brains can do. And I think it's important to, remember, what is your core goal? And if your core goal is to be inclusive, then leading with that, even when you get feedback that makes you kind of cringe a little bit, is really important.
Wow, that's wonderful. So what does the future look like for DEI training? It's been around for a while. And by diversity, equity, I think, do we also include the Me Too movement and learning to respect women, sexual harassment as well?
I think we can include it all. But I think inherent in that question is what's so interesting about my job, is that a lot of times when people come to me and say they want diversity, equity, and inclusion training, they are talking about a big umbrella of possibilities. And so part of what I have to do is understand, what are your actual goals? And the goals, if you are talking about sexual harassment prevention, or the outcome that I will do if you're talking about sexual harassment prevention, versus if you're talking about creating an inclusive leadership model, versus talking about anti-racism, I might do different approaches depending on each of those things.
That's why I asked that.
I know.
Thank you. Good.
The future to me actually goes back to the question that you asked me earlier about the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in a nutshell, the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion says that companies who prioritize having diversity, companies that are representative more in terms of racial and ethnic minority groups, in terms of gender, that those companies outperform their competitors who are more homogenous. So the idea is, if you are more diverse, you will have a better financial outcome. So that's a business case. And diversity is good for business.
Talk a little bit about why that is so.
So there's many reasons, but one of them goes back to how we have conversations with people who are different from us. So there's this thing that happens when you're talking to people who look similar to you. that you assume they're going to agree with you. This is just a natural thing that we do. We assume we share a common reality. And so what that means when I'm talking to you is that I'm less likely to give you very elaborate, detailed sentences. I might trail off more. You ever had that conversation where you're talking to somebody say, oh, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they probably do, right? Especially if they know you well or if they look like you. We are less likely to rely on those kinds of shortcuts when we're talking to people who are different from us because we don't assume that we share the same reality. And so it actually prompts us to communicate more in a more detailed way, to elaborate more on our thoughts. And while this takes a little bit longer, it actually leads us to make better decisions overall. So part of the reason that diverse teams are better, are smarter, are more creative than homogenous teams is because the way that they are communicating and the way that they are making decisions is fundamentally different than how those homogenous teams are making decisions.
Right, because you have a different you have lots of different viewpoints.
Yes.
And different experiences.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And the company should reflect your market.
Well, absolutely. And this is one of the other things that I think this gets into what I would call the moral case for diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I think is best captured by what one of the CEOs that I've worked with who said, I don't care that diversity in my company is going to help me make more money. Quite frankly, if diversity didn't help me make more money, I would still prioritize it because it's just the right thing to do, right? Because I know that if I am creating a product that is going to serve a global world, my company needs to reflect that. What I think is interesting is that the future of DEI for me looks like a shift from people saying, I am doing this because someone's telling me I'm supposed to I'm doing this because I know that it's the right thing to do. And I think that that's really where I'm trying to get a lot of my clients to go. I can talk to you all day about how having diversity is going to help you in your organization, how having inclusive policies is going to be good, how making sure that your practices are equitable in terms of outcomes are going to be better for your bottom line. But ultimately, we're doing this not just because I want to make you more money, but because I believe that it is imperative that organizations are creating environments where everyone can thrive. And that is really the core of why I do this work.
This is wonderful. I was thinking, as we move ahead, what can we do? How can we start out personally to stretch our boundaries, if you will?
Yeah. So my first recommendation is to simply think about the people who are in your personal friendship network and think about the people who are in your professional network. This is especially important for senior leaders and executives to do, because what I find is that the more senior you get in an organization, the more senior you get in your career, the more the people who are in your orbit share your same race, gender, political beliefs, sexual orientation, religion, all of that. And there's actually some really interesting research that finds that for most people, our personal friendship groups are also made up of people who share our same race, religion, and voting preferences. So we need to take stock of who we're hearing from. The reason for that is that if you are only talking to people who believe everything that you do, you are missing out on opportunities to hear about others' experiences in ways that might powerfully shape your view of the world. What I've actually found in my own research is that the more that white people in particular, heard about stories of bias that African Americans faced, the more likely those white people were to say, wow, anti-Black racism is definitely a thing that I should worry about. And they were more willing to support efforts to combat that racism. People who didn't have that same exposure were more likely to say, you're just complaining, get over it, grow a thicker skin. And so this complainer effect is most likely to happen when we aren't exposed to people who are different from us. So that exposure is really key. So I would say start by just taking inventory of who you're talking to.
Okay. Then how can we ask for the real conversations? How can we ask someone who doesn't look like us what their experience is
Yeah.
without being obnoxious or impolite.
Yeah. So, as somebody who both does this for a living and also has had people ask me questions when I am not on the clock, so to speak, I definitely have experienced this kind of this difference. What I would say is that you should first begin by seeking to create genuine relationships with people. So, while I definitely want to look at my friendship network and say, am I hearing from people who are disabled, for example? What I should not then do is say, how can I find a disabled person at my company and go up to them and say, I'd like to be your friend because I don't have any disabled people in my orbit and I want to talk about your experience, right?
Right.
And of course, it sounds silly, right? But that is sometimes what I think people are thinking I'm asking them to do. What I would say actually is just start by noticing who you gravitate toward in those settings. So if you find that if you're having a workplace conversation, maybe you're in person or maybe it's on Zoom and you're listening more to the people who look like you, or you're sending Slack messages or Teams messages to people who are on your same, in your same department, or who share your same background, try mixing it up, right? Try having, especially if you're a leader, have a list of the people in your company and maybe rotate who you're meeting with regularly. So it becomes a part of what you are doing. And I would say if you don't have people that you can connect with personally, the internet is a great place to start. So I like to follow people. I love Twitter. So I follow people on Twitter and Instagram that are going to introduce me to a variety of different perspectives, so that I can just be more aware of the conversations that are happening. So I would recommend that, as you're doing that inventory, think not just about who you're interacting with in real time, but think about the interactions that you are having on social media as well. And that's another way that you can start to almost like passively infuse your mind with different perspectives as a way to get this started.
Wow. I love the idea of rotating through the people you know.
Yeah.
To invite other people and to not just talk to the same people all the time, which involves a little bit of effort. So this is intentional.
Yep.
But I think it's a really good one. I know one of my colleagues works in a large company, and they have a random once a week, you get 15 minutes with someone you didn't know before. And it's a random choice.
Yeah.
And you just have a 15-minute conversation of who are you, what makes you tick, what makes you interesting. So
yeah, that sounds lovely. I also, the introvert in me feels like, oh my gosh, that sounds so daunting to have a random 15-minute conversation, right? So I love that. I will say for myself, something that I do at my company is I host monthly office hours where I just invite everybody from the company to come and hang out, and we talk about whatever is on people's minds, not related to work. So my 4 dogs and my cat often make an appearance. And what I like about that is that I actually, and for anybody who's listening from Paradigm, spoiler alert, I'm doing this, I take attendance on the side to see who's coming. And when I don't see people from different teams, I actually reach out to them specifically and say, hey, I'd love to see you at the next one. And so that's a way that I'm taking something that works for me, right? Those one-on-ones are harder for me to manage, but a group session where everybody is coming together is a great way to build community. And my intentional piece on the backside is making sure that I am seeing a variety of people. And if I'm not, I make sure I let them know, going back to belonging, going back to being intentional, I let them know, hey, I missed you. I want to see you. And maybe they say, oh, I'm busy, I can't, what have you. But sometimes they say, great, I'll be at the next one. And it's a great way to make sure that I'm intentionally fostering that sense of belonging and connection within my workplace.
I love that. I love that. Well, Evelyn Carter, Dr. Evelyn Carter, thank you so much for being a guest here on Speakers Who Get Results. This was awesome. We're going to put all your information in the show notes. So if anybody was as intrigued by this as I am, look in the show notes and you'll be able to find out how to learn more about her. She is truly awesome. Thanks so much for being our guest.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. This has been Speakers Who Get Results. And if you found this interesting, please like us on Facebook, follow us on LinkedIn. Please go to YouTube and subscribe. We love all the reviews you can get. Apple podcast reviews are especially good for rating. So it helps other people find these conversations. This has been Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, and I'll see you on the next one.
We have just concluded another great episode of Speakers Who Get Results with your host, Elizabeth Bachman. If you got value from today's episode, please feel free to share us with your friends and colleagues. You may also visit elizabethbachman.com for additional resources. Be sure to tune in every week for new episodes, and thanks for tuning in.